Good morning to those of you in South Bend, Indiana. Good afternoon to those of you in Dublin, Ireland. And wherever you are in the world, warmest welcome to the 2021 Hibernian Lecture. My name is Kathleen Cummings, and I'm the director of the Keough Center for the Study of American Catholicism. In the 40 years since this lecture was been inaugurated, I don't think we've had a more anticipated Hibernian lecture. As many of you know, this was supposed to have been held in conjunction with the Notre Dame Navy game in Dublin, Ireland in August of 2020. Then we had hoped to have it in person in South Bend this year, but once again, COVID postponed, the disruptions of the pandemic postponed those plans. So we are delighted to be hosting this lecture virtually. And although we greatly anticipate the day when we can all be together in person, we're so happy to have this time together in this setting. I'd like to turn it over to our colleague, Kevin Whelan in Dublin, to welcome us to our virtual gathering. Oh, Kevin, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Good afternoon, as it is here in Dublin. Good morning, as I'm sure it is in the United States. We are very happy, as always, to partner with our great colleagues at Notre Dame in the Keough Center, and Kathleen has been a loyal and generous and supportive friend of ours for many, many years, and long may that last into the future. Also delighted to welcome the Ancient Order of Hibernians, who have always been closely linked with the University of Notre Dame. You're very welcome virtually to Dublin, and I'm delighted that we're able to host this event here.
Thank you again, Kevin. I'd like to acknowledge, before I introduce our speaker, a few people joining us today. The staff and the fellows of the Keough Institute for Irish Studies, co-sponsoring today's lecture, always a wonderful partner to the Keough Center. And of course, as Kevin already said, our good friends at Notre Dame's Dublin Global Gateway, and especially its director, Kevin Whelan, for co-hosting and for bringing Declan to the Gateway this morning. We also extend a very special welcome to the members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians who are with us today. Thank you again for your support and for joining us virtually again this year. And we look forward to seeing you again in person very soon. I want to also thank Tim and everyone from Notre Dame Studios for helping us with the technology, and of course, the staff at the Keough Center for organizing this event. For over 40 years, the Hibernian support has enabled the Keough Center to promote the study of Irish and Irish American history and culture in a variety of ways. Of course, the centerpiece of the Keough Center's commitment to Irish studies has long been the Hibernian Lecture, and I'm so very pleased to introduce Professor Declan Kiberd as our lecturer today. Declan is the Donald and Marilyn Keough Professor of Irish Studies and Professor of English and Irish Language and Literature Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. Before teaching at Notre Dame, Professor Kiberd taught at the University of Kent, Trinity College, and University College Dublin. He specializes in modern Irish and English literature and is an international authority on the literature of Ireland. He has written and edited numerous influential works. I'll just mention a very few of them: Men and Feminism in Irish Literature, Irish Classics, The Irish Writer and the World, Inventing Ireland, Ulysses and Us, The Art of Everyday Life in Joyce's Masterpiece, along with P.J. Matthews, The Handbook of the Irish Revival, 1891 to 1922. Harvard University Press has published his most recent book, After Ireland, Writing the Nation from Becket to the Present. And his current projects are Becket Unknown, Mysticism Without God, and a book about cricket, England and Eternity, anticipated for release in August of 2022. Audiences in some 30 countries worldwide have enjoyed Declan's lectures, and his reviews and essays have appeared in publications like the Irish Times, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, and the New York Times. In 2019, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and began work on the Keough Institute Global Ulysses Initiative, a celebration of the centenary of James Joyce's novel. He has taught numerous undergraduate and graduate students at Notre Dame, and he's taught all of his colleagues a great deal too. He's been a leading scholar at the Keough Institute's Summer Graduate Irish Seminar and has lectured in that capacity in Dublin, Keough, Buenos Aires, and Oxford. The title of Declan's lecture today is Ireland Now, Excavating the Present. Declan will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we hope to have some audience questions, some of which have been submitted in advance. I will moderate those and we'll conclude in 1 hour. With that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Declan Kiberd. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for inviting me, and thank you, friends, for being here today, and indeed here virtually across the sea. I'm delighted to hear that people are submitting questions before the lecture has even been given. It reminds me of the time when the horoscope writer for The Sun was dismissed, and the editor wrote to him a letter that began, "As you will already know, we are not happy with your performance." I hope that doesn't come through today. I think the future is unpredictable and exhilarating to precisely that extent. Nobody really knows. Yet our present was once somebody's future. The only evidence that that future did once exist. 30 years ago, who would have predicted that the DUP and Sinn Féin would share power, however jerkily and uneasily? The affluence of Tiger Ireland was predicted by Sinn Féin in 1921, but not in 1991. So you can see that predictions change over time for reasons that I'll explore. It can seem dangerous and foolhardy to extrapolate from the immediate present to a future. And yet I think it's necessary to do so, because one of our current problems is present tensism, an inability to understand time as stretching over past and future. There's a short-termism in the readings that led economists to forget the history of their own discipline, the history of previous bubbles, and it left everyone at the mercy of the last recession and the immediate moment. It was a kind of provincialism in space and a provincialism in time. And you lose, without a sense of past and future, you lose a sense of momentum through time. I thought a few years ago, when there was a high instance of youth suicides, that might be because young people were not being given the gift of momentum, of feeling they were going from somewhere to somewhere, which of course is accompanied often by a fear of the future. And the modular systems of education in colleges offered them often just chunks of limited information. I mean, there are colleges now where you can study the early novels of Roddy Doyle, the history of the Olympic Games, and controversies of medieval gynecology, all in the same degree, but nobody will link it up for you. And what's lost is a sense of chronology, of some things coming before and after others, of Emmett before O'Connell, of Yeats before Joyce. And the talk in the college administration buildings is about transferable skills, lifelong learning, and so on, and how the arts degree is particularly good to equip students for adaptability in the future economy. It's very interesting in that context to watch young people coping, not just with the recent recession, but now with the virus itself. 3 or 4 years ago, stand-up comics would constantly talk about the snowflake generation, over-entitled, fragile. But when I look at our students who have come through 2 desperate years and have lost many of the graces and advantages of education, I think they have been toughened and hardened and may well emerge as one of the great generations of this unfolding century. The only valid extrapolation of the future must be based not just on the present, but on the past. If you think of the Bible, the prophets in the Bible were not really some newspaper starball gazers. They were predictors, and they did it by looking so deeply into the realities of the present that the shape of the future became discernible. This is what Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican author, wrote. We must imagine the past and remember the future. And the future would be one day the only evidence that we present people once existed. We must go back in order to go forward, as the French say, reculer pour mieux sauter. Only way to be original is to go back to origins. And I think it's one of the reasons why modernist artists were so haunted by primitivism. Why, Picasso looked at the wall cave paintings. Joyce went back to Homer. We are the primitives of the electronic technological civilization, still only beginning, and we're only learning how to control these monsters. So the question is, how would a reimagining of the past have some relevance to all these debates? We had in Ireland over a century ago a revival, because we are told 6 gifted people lived in the same city and hated one another accordingly. A central idea of that revival was self-help. After the failure of Westminster to deliver the promised Home Rule, you get the Gaelic League emerging and linking economic success to cultural self-belief. The Gaelic League it is which starts the Patrick's Day parades. If there is a march past Macy's in New York every Patrick's Day, that is due to the work done by Douglas Hyde and the Gaelic League. The cooperative movement, it was an attack on the, if you like, torpor of Irish agriculture and industry. But the interesting thing about it is that Joyce's first stories were printed and published in the Irish Homestead, next to the week's cattle and manure prices, which was very embarrassing to him. He said, it's called the pig's paper. And he actually adopted the pen name Stephen Dedalus, so he wouldn't be utterly humiliated by the company he was keeping. But it was a great paper. And his main theme was the same theme as that paper, paralysis and how to cure it. And Joyce was a real revivalist. And he tried to launch the first afternoon newspaper here in Dublin to be called The Goblin. And it would need, friends said, a vast sum of money, but would be based on continental models. He opened the first commercial cinema, the Volta, in Dublin in 1909. And he also tried to sell Irish tweed from the Dublin woolen mills in Trieste. He was an incredibly practical man as well as a visionary. He has in Ulysses the climax of the book arriving when the ad canvasser meets the poet, when, if you like, the bourgeois and the bohemian sing hand in hand. And that, I think, is the real meaning of our revival. If you look at the records of the Abbey Theatre, it was self-financing in its first decades. And you can look at the ledgers kept by WB with all the loving care of a super accountant. In fact, when Yeats was sometimes asked to pay people things, he would write on the check, "Yours sincerely, W.B. Yeats," in hopes that the receivers would not cash the checks, would put them on walls as works of art. But the whole idea of modern advertising is implicit in the revival. The use of the logo, for instance, of Maeve with the Hound, which the Abbey had from its inception. Or you think of Leopold Bloom crossing the quays in Ulysses for the firm of Alexander J. Keyes, but also to remember the Vatican with its symbol and the House of Parliament, the Manx House of Parliament, with connotations of home rule. So the whole idea of Sinn Féin, ourselves, was a kind of cultural and political movement which had as its intended economic corollary of people gaining economic self-government. This country is small. It's about the size of Birmingham. And the same people were involved in all these movements. But I don't think they were nostalgists. They weren't trying to return to the past. They were what I would call critical traditionalists, and they wanted to open a new future. And they saw the revolutionary potential in their own tradition. So Joyce would gift wrap one of Europe's oldest books, The Odyssey, but he would produce the most radical modern narrative in that gift wrapping. In the same way, Pearce, who believed in child-centered education, a la Montessori, said it would just be a return to the methods used by St. Kevin and Clonmacnoise. And Connolly said socialism would really be just the old communal system of land holding, only now the government would hold it instead of the chief in the name of the people. In other words, they presented something very new as a revival of something reassuringly old and familiar. In just the same way that electric lights were made to look like the gas lights they were replacing, or upholstery in motor cars resembled that in the horse carriages they were replacing. I think sometimes this masking was too successful. And that as a result, 1916, the uprising, has been recorded in too many books as an attempt by nostalgists to set the clock back to a medieval world. But actually, it was an attempt to achieve alternative forms of modernity, other than those available under the British Empire. Cormac O'Quillinon, who was a professor of chemistry, who was a member of that movement, said it was an attempt to put an end to the rule of the fairies in Ireland. And I think that has its meanings. The latent, as opposed to the manifest meaning of the rising, is really hyper-modernity. You have 70 women fighting as soldiers in a rebel army against an army which has no female soldiers. You have Hannah Skeffington being made a member of the first fugitive government at a time when women didn't still have to vote. Lennon understood this. He said the misfortune of the Irish was that they rose too soon, which is probably the only time we've been accused of rising too early in the morning. But he said the revolt of the European proletariat would have been mature a year later, as it seemed to be in 1917. And the Irish were unfortunate in attempting to set up a welfare state 1 year too early. I think that modernity continued in disguised forms in the new state, which we're often encouraged to condescend to. But if you think about it, the first outside broadcasting of a sporting event happened in Ireland in the 1920s, the first in the world. And some of the earliest examples of semi-state industrial and agricultural bodies were developed here in Ireland. And every second event in those past decades has been given the look of a repressive tradition in most writings, when often it's exactly the opposite. And indeed, the leaders are accused of being abject in the face of church authority, when in fact what happened was the country's politics was so divided after the Civil War that political figures needed to hold on to the Catholic Church for coherence and reassurance. But for instance, the Eucharistic Congress in 1932 is often cited as an example of the increasing hegemony of a traditional form of Catholicism. But I have met people who told me it was actually held to sell radios for the first time to the Irish public. And of course, we know that the voice of John McCormack became famous throughout Ireland by the use of these radios, about which Brian Friel wrote so brilliantly in that great play, Dancing with Lunacy, where indeed he makes the link. I think in retrospect, the achievement of that generation is astonishing. The great modernist literature, the first country in the English-speaking world to decolonize. The one element of failure was that we didn't have economic liftoff coincident with cultural and political liftoff. At the start of the new state, Shaw in London was asked, what do the fearful words Sinn Féin mean? And he said, it is the Irish for John Bull. But Irish industry never really took off in the ways that were hoped for by people like Pearse, by Joyce, and so on. And the real question is, why did the coming of this affluence take so long? And why was it so shaky when it came? There are various answers, and I'll give you a few now by way of suggestion. I think the fact that the Republicans lost the Civil War removed from the scene many people who would have been entrepreneurial. If you walk down Broadway in New York, you would see vans with written on the side, FX Brennan, established 1925. It's a link to the entrepreneurial idea, which also informed the French revolutions of 1789, that business energy could link with cultural revolution. But in Ireland, the problem was that the War of Independence was followed by a civil war, which left our people exhausted and suspicious of newfangled ideas, including Republican ones. It induced a conservatism in people who fell back exhausted on the old British forms. And they had vowed to extirpate those forms, but there was no decentralization. There was no introduction of co-ops of the kind that Russell and Plunkett would have wished for. John McGahern once said to me that you even need a wider time frame to understand these events. That what happened in 1921 was just a moment in the ongoing decay of rural Ireland, and that what was happening was that one ruling elite in desperation was handing over responsibility for the management of the rural crisis to another elite. We know that the crash of 29 came at a very bad time for Ireland, and it was followed by the economic war. And British forms, unmodified, calcified in Ireland, just as they would do in India after independence. Rushdie, in the great book about that Indian experience, notices how the skin of the rulers is getting paler with every passing year. And the Irish too were bending over backwards to become like those they had extirpated. Sean Dufresne once pointed out that for every English action, there had to be an equal and opposite Irish reaction. For the Parliament, we had a Dáil. For Gaelic, we had soccer. For hurling, we had cricket. A kilt instead of trousers, even though historians have proven that the ancient Irish did not wear kilts and were wise enough not to do so in their rainy environment. Nevertheless, as Joe Lee often said, the cry went, down with trousers. What Dufresne is talking about is the device of national parallelism, and not England. Instead of soccer, you have Gaelic. And you have this not England called Ireland, which in some way is based on a kind of neurosis. The belief that if the empire was won on the playing fields of Eton, it could be extirpated by the sports of Gaelic football and hurling on the playing fields of North Mon and O'Connell schools. So the education that was perfected in the mid-century, the one I had, was actually very much based on British models. I mean, we read the same textbooks in Latin class about SPQR. And indeed, even the Legion of Mary, when it was spreading its lay apostolate, used the imagery of legionnaires with the quasi-Roman inflection. Cuchulainn was to be the Irish version of the Arturiad. And I, for instance, in 1969, when I did my leaving cert, I did Latin as one of the subjects. And the less academic boys in the hour after lunch, while we studied Latin, studied something called commerce. And then we would go off to debates with the local girls' school, asking why our economy wasn't taking off. The answer was staring us in the face. In those years, France, Germany, the US was aware of the need for practical education. Even in the UK, Wilson began to talk of the white heat of the technological revolution. But the self-image of college students in the early 1970s, when I was in Trinity, was strongly anti-business and anti-industrial. It was a weird blend of 1960s radicalism and the ideas of Jane Austen about trade. Very strange fusion. I remember when the university I ended up spending most of my life in used to be in Belfield. When Belfield went up, Trinity students snobbishly referred to it as Belfield Polytechnic. The word polytechnic, which was a term of praise in Germany or France, had become a term of abuse in Ireland itself. And the few people in Ireland who emerged with great affluence in those years often wanted to signalize their affluence by adopting a rural-looking lifestyle. So you have people buying big houses in the countryside around Dublin. And perhaps the most notorious of all those gentlemen, Charles Haughey, rides to hounds on his horses, as if to suggest that rural Ireland is still the real Ireland. So, despite the efforts of the industrial development of Irish first Kaluntish, business was still a somewhat secondary activity in those years. And we would kind of sneer at the class traitors who put on suits at the end of the academic year to be interviewed by Arthur Anderson and company. But a lot of very, very clever people who would have been great business people went for other kinds of work. Number one, priests and nuns. And of course, this wasn't just a disaster. I mean, many of the nuns especially ended up running huge hospitals or large schools in Africa, where they displayed their great business acumen. But that, in a sense, was lost to people in Ireland. The same with the priests. And if you think about it, this applies even in literature, because they did not reproduce themselves. We don't know how many great texts, great works of art, were lost. You look at 19th century England and Ireland and how the Protestant rectories produced a great deal of the cultural value that emanated. But this was lost within the Catholic fold because of the tradition of celibacy. It's also true, I think, about people who became diplomats and civil servants. In my time lecturing overseas on Irish literature, I had the privilege of the friendship and kindness of many of our ambassadors and secretaries. And they all struck me as incredibly gifted people who would have prospered in business if they had only been allowed to try. And indeed, they ended up almost being that by promoting Irish beef, our technology, arts and crafts, as they still do very effectively today. The thing that prevented all this probably was undercapitalization. The inability of many of these people to get their hands on money, which might have made a good idea incarnate. It's a drearily familiar story. Bob Geldof was on television just a few nights ago, and he said that he, before he ever became a boomtown rat, founded a magazine called Buy and Sell. And he went into the Bank of Ireland to try and get money to make it bigger and gooder, flashier and better. And the man took one look at his strangly hair and said, no thanks. Buy and Sell is still on sale in the Irish shops, but the banks couldn't see the wisdom of the project. About the same time, my father in 1973 had developed a small business, but the banks foreclosed on at Christmas, the Christmas of the famous oil crisis. And I think there were a tremendous amount of creative people who got blocked in these ways. You compare it with what happened to the Irish overseas, to I'm sure many of the people who were members of the Hibernians. They could sometimes get their hands on cash. And when they could, they often did very well. On one of my first trips to the States, I was in Seattle and I saw a tea towel with a very Irish message. It said simply, hire the Irish before they hire you. Those at home, though, found the bank managers difficult, the interest rates high and confidence low. Now, I think to some degree what changed it was the Free Education Act introduced by Minister Donogh O'Malley in 1967, which brought children from humbler economic backgrounds into secondary education. Their presence immediately had an effect, and you begin to see subjects like accountancy, engineering, economics, building methods appear on the curriculum. And also, of course, under the changing rules of the European Union, deregulation leads to greater economic opportunity. And it's often spearheaded by diplomats and civil servants, as well as by business people, who finally get some access to cash at amazingly low rates of interest, as we have seen in recent decades. So in one way, the economic aim of Sinn Féin began to prosper in the 1990s. And this was not a bad thing. The only problem was this was to be a three-pronged movement, not just economics, but politics and culture. And the politics and culture seemed to lose steam, even as the economics were taking off. For instance, when I sat in my school in Latin class, I knew that there was 70% of the students in the country taking Latin in their leaving certificate. That's down to less than 4% now. We went from one extreme to the other. A knowledge of the slow evolution of English literature from Shakespeare to the present was needed in order to get your leaving cert. But now there's a tremendous emphasis on contemporary texts, on kind of Seamus, I feel your pain essays. My colleague in UCD years ago, Moore MacDougall, once appeared on a program called Lifeline, and he said that most of the people along with him around the table were being paid to emote rather than analyze. Now, the economic success wasn't just part of the dot-com mirage, because in the early days of the Tiger, there were very brilliant innovations. Good food companies were created, artisan foods that were sold next day to Paris, to Frankfurt. There were excellent machines built, and gifted young people, young women architects, won prizes with work of the highest quality. But I think there were two phases of the Tiger art. It began, say, in 95, and the heroic phase lasted till 2002. The period when people who came in were proud of the culture they brought with them, but also wanted to learn about the Irish culture they were meeting. And these were the years when you would see, for instance, that first place in Irish in the leading cert was often gained by a Romanian or a German family, by a student from that family. And there was a genuine fusion of traditions. I think from 02 to the crash in 09, what replaced all that was bling culture. People heard that there was money in Ireland and came rather thoughtlessly into the place, just as many of its own denizens thoughtlessly pursued the money with less thought about culture. So in the end, the culture that produced the Tiger led to a loss of many traditions. And I think also to a collapse of many of the old democratic ideas that had animated the revivalists. Like 100 years ago, or even 120, if you left secondary school, you were considered to be a fully formed individual with access to the common culture. You could read a play like Hamlet, you would explain how electricity worked, you would know the heroic myths of Ireland and Greece, and you would also understand in your physics class how water went from Palafuca Reservoir to the domestic tap in Dublin. And this, incidentally, is really what you need to know in order to read Ulysses. It's what Joyce needed to write it. What I'm saying is, in those decades of mass literacy, the reading of ordinary men and women was rich, wise, and deep. Joyce's classmates used to play party games about Shakespeare. Joyce would dress up as Queen Gertrude, strewing cauliflowers on the floor, imitating Gertrude's laments for the lost Ophelia. And when Anu McMaster brought his traveling theatrical group into Limerick Station, he opened a window and asked the porter, "Are we really in Limerick now?" And the porter smiled, recognizing him, and said, "Why, sir, this is Illyria." So in those days, nobody thought that Shakespeare was elitist or an imposition on that man, shoveling the cases on Limerick Station. Those were the days when people made their own music, their own entertainment. When recordings came out, they would crowd around the record player and listen intensely and repeatedly to the songs, the way my generation did when Blonde and Blonde and Beggar's Banquet came out, listening to the same music over and over. Democracy was seen as the right of everybody, whether wealthy or not, to have access to the uses of literacy. R.H. Toney, the great socialist, said, "Opportunities to rise are no substitute for general diffusion of the means of civilization, needful to all, whether they're rich or poor." And this was the period when deference to authority began to decline, when the working man and the landless laborer and the female typist would all proclaim themselves as people of inherent dignity, worthy of respect. And when the authorities knew that anyone could understand a play by Shakespeare. But what happened since then is a major set of cultural shifts. And I think a replacement of the idea of character with that of personality, and a completely new notion of the cultural person, who is now expected to move from place to place rather than devote themselves to stillness and stability. I think this is one of the things that made it harder and harder for young people to believe in a lasting commitment, because the economy they found themselves in put such a premium on adaptability and movement. And college courses have often wrongly fed these trends. The old idea of the college as a place where you bonded with classmates and went afterwards to pick off the details in the lecture you just heard, or even pick off the flaws in the backline of Manchester United. Those days went, students were forever hurrying to a part-time job or a meeting off canvas. And I think they found it harder and harder in the age of digital culture to express, it's a paradox, express emotion openly to each other, even though Moore McDougall was talking about people emoting on radio. But I found it in tutorials much harder if you were teaching a text by someone like Tolstoy or George Eliot, to get students to talk openly to each other about emotion. They would do it at 2 o'clock in the morning with their hands on a laptop and maybe a wine or two in their tummies, but they weren't doing it so easily as their predecessors had done in everyday academic tutorials. And I think all this produced a new kind of worker, technocratic, who worked not with this heroic entrepreneurial idea of business as inherently noble and adding to national value. Instead of the risk-taking entrepreneur, you have the fretful clerk. And the academic version of this is the younger academic who doesn't have tenure, who has to keep publishing 1 or 2 pieces a year in order to hold on to the prospect of staying in the university, but can never hope to contemplate a 5 or 10-year project that had the heroic about it, or indeed a project which might take 10 years and come to nothing at all. There are specialists in every department now, but they're often disinclined to teach outside their own immediate area. Gone are the days when I went into the English department, it used to be, you were expected to teach anything from Chaucer to Seamus Heaney. But now people, there's one person who's a Joycean and someone else who does women's poetry of the Victorian period, etc., etc. In other words, no longer is the idea that anyone bright enough can read and understand Ulysses, but certain subgroups can be made clever enough to form the subgroups that do that in their subgroups. So you have the social movements aiming at the inclusion of gifted individuals in the dominant structure, rather than trying to transform the whole social structure itself. This period has loosened, I think, family ties and even the ideas of friendship, and it penalizes people who put a premium on family or community. So, as Richard Sennett once said, the world is now divided between overpaid experts and underpaid service providers. But both of these groups suffer from job insecurity, and the sheer liquidity of the lifestyle would have been unthinkable 50, 100 years ago. Now, when I came into this subject as a teacher of Irish literature and would be asked for the core expressions of Irish identity, I always quoted Joyce: language, religion, and nationalism, as mentioned in Portrait of the Artist. Look what's happened. In some senses, each of them, once a sacred value, is now no longer trusted. The language went, first of all, in the middle of the 19th century. In 1980, I was on a radio program with Father Peter Connolly of Maynooth and Seamus Heaney. And Father Connolly said an astounding thing. Remember, it's 1980. He said, in the next 20 years, religion will go in Ireland. And when it's going, it'll go so fast that no one will know what's happening. I looked at him and thought, wow, this is a soundbite. Keep away from it. And Seamus Heaney was, famous Seamus, guarded as hell too. But we had coffee with the good father afterwards, and we asked him what he meant. And he said, well, look what happened to Irish in the middle of the 19th century. When people decided it was no longer central or useful to them, they started speaking English. And we said, but look, we had the Pope here last year. 1 million people turned up in Dublin, 1 million again in Galway. It was the church triumphant. And Father Peter said, no, it was not the church triumphant. He said the Pope came because he was sent for. This was the first time the Pope had come. He was sent for because of the massive decline in vocations in the previous decade, ever since 1967. So there is a sense in which Joyce's 3 keys to identity were and are in some kind of crisis. If you think about the third one, nationality, wow. I mean, the Belfast Agreement basically abandons a territorial claim. Antrim is now as British as it is Irish because it is both. I can't think of any comparable example of a people voting in their adult lifetimes to reduce the territorial claim made by their country. So you would think language, religion, nation. What's left? I wouldn't want to be depressed about this, though. It seems to me that all through Irish history, when something is given up, it reemerges in modified form because of the gift of our people for adaptation. So, for example, after the vacuum left by the loss of the Irish language in many places, you have the emergence of Hibernian English, the English that made Joyce, Yeats, Lady Gregory world famous, an English used by people using English words, but thinking in Irish. Is it tomorrow you're going to town? Is it to town that you're going tomorrow? And the cultural vacuum was filled by all kinds of other useful institutions, like a national theatre, Sinn Féin, the Gaelic League. In other words, after a death, a resurrection. I think the same about the Belfast Agreement, that what died in 1998, when the vast majority of our people voted for the agreement, was the old style narrow gauge nationalism. And what we are developing in its stead is civic nationalism, a completely different thing, and perfectly to be lauded. Now, the irony is that while we're doing that, our neighbor next door is finally having their Easter Rising, which they had, appropriately enough, in 2016, Brexit. But they're coming very late to the fashion parade of nations. That kind of nationalism is, I think, long past its sell-by. And in fact, the Irish are giving a good example of how you can be both European and Irish at the same time, something they learned from writers like Samuel Beckett, who has written some of the great works in the French as well as the Hibernian English language. Just as a literary person, I'd like to make a final point. I have increasingly come to the view that art is an early warning system of things that are going wrong in the wider society. And that if only people read texts more sensitively, they would be more fully aware sooner of these malfunctions. And the fact that we put Joyce and Swift on the last currency that was national, the last note paper that was national, I think indicates that we're willing to learn from these people. I'll give you an example. In Beckett's Waiting for Godot, one of the main subjects is the capacity of people to live as if normal in a wholly abnormal situation. That began under British misrule, of course. It continued, I think, through the recent austerity, because many people will say that the Irish taxpayer should not have had to pay for the sins of the bankers, but they put up with it and did. In the same way, someone like John McGahern drew attention in his novel The Dark to the facts of child abuse. 30 years before they become reportable in Ireland's daily papers. Ditto with Edna O'Brien. She showed how the sexual urges of young women in the rural community couldn't be easily contained in that community. And journalism of the last 30 years is just one long oligo about that. But if people had really read Edna's book deeply, the warning might have come sooner and the remedy earlier. So I do believe that literature, as always, has an important function, as in any society, but particularly in ours, because ours has always been a laboratory, once for colonialism, then for naked capitalism, and now, in recent times, as poster boys for austerity. And of course, we haven't always helped our own case. We tend to do one thing at a time. We focused on monoculture in the 19th century, over-reliant on one crop. In the 20th century, over-reliant on the Catholic Church to prop up a doddering state. And in the 21st, on buying and selling houses to one another. But I do think that the return to these great texts of the revival in particular, but of Irish writers in general, can only be helpful to the further development of our society. And indeed, the critique of Brexit has been often most interestingly made by writers, some of whom are English and who are saying it is setting England back 100 years and could indeed set Northern Ireland back too. I remember noticing this in the 1990s when the flag of St. George began to be flown at soccer matches and rugby matches. You could see it coming. And Tony and Byatt in 1999, brought out a book called the Oxford Book of English Short Stories, not British short stories. Even among the hyper-respectable upper middle classes, the Oxbridge set nationalism that had been denied because of the British scheme was re-emergent. A nationalism which led many English people to feel like they were living in an occupied country. Just the same complaint that Pearse and Connolly had made a century earlier. The notion that Englishness had been drained of all cultural meaning by the terrible demands made on it by being part of the British scheme and pretending that all these English things like roast beef and cricket were to be, part of the UK. Pop culture tended to go down also in the last decade of the last century and the noughties because people found it lucrative to build apartments and blow up the old pubs. And that was a danger sign that the sense of public space was being lost. The pub is like the beach in Brazil. It's where the classes meet without let or hindrance. And the diminishment in the number of pubs is a sort of danger signal about the loss of public space. Now, I think the enthusiastic use of public space has been restored by many of the immigrants who've come in and who have better ideas of how public space is used. You'll hear them in the buses. If you go for a walk on the seafront in Clontarf, you realize that they come from cultures where everything has not been finally privatized. And let us hope that we can learn from them, that they can take the story of Deirdre or Cuchulainn and reinterpret it in the light of their own traditions, which I think is what's actually happening at the moment. And that just as we've had fusion food, we are going to have in the next 10, 15 years, a fusion literature as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Declan. That was wonderful. Worth the wait. Well worth the wait. You do you've actually answered some of the questions that were submitted in advance, but I'll ask you one of them anyway as we await more questions from our virtual audience. And then if there are questions from where you are, please let us know. But one question that was asked by Sarah McKibben, you've already gestured toward it in so many ways, but she asks, what are 3 to 4 concrete changes in policy, practice, or law that would be the most positively transformative for Ireland today? If you were able to enact 3 to 4 changes, what would they be?
Most unlikely. I think that you have to do what's possible rather than utopian. And for example, if I had been asked at the start of this century, gay marriage, the rights of gay and lesbian people to have all the protections of institutional marriage as recognized by the state. That did happen because the people voted for it a few years ago. I was in Italy actually when the referendum was passed, and my Italian friends who are mostly left-wing said this would never happen in our natural country. But I was pointing out to them, as I often do to Notre Dame students, that this was an example of how Irish people are both archaic and avant-garde, critical traditionalists. Because in one sense, it was a gesture out of the future, which many other countries in Eastern Europe might not yet tolerate. But on the other hand, it was a traditional recognition of the value of the family as a stabilizing element in a society. So on that basis, I would try and see, what elements already exist in Irish tradition that can have a new spin put on them. For instance, I mean, it's not legislation, but and experts are getting very bad rap from certain quarters in the last few years. But experts weren't just denounced by Donald Trump; they were denounced by George Orwell and Jonathan Swift as well. People who over-specialize in one thing. So I would insist that the educational systems roll back a bit from the specialization I was denouncing, and that even people studying medicine, say in Trinity, should have to do, as once they did, an arts degree as well, some study in arts. Now, I know in America, and particularly in NT, many people who want to become doctors of medicine take a humanities course, first of all, but here in Ireland, they haven't done so. And I think it has made the lives of doctors very difficult, because if they had read Anna Karenina, if they knew Kiberd, some of the human tragedies enacted before their eyes, even now, would be a little easier to narrate and translate. Doctors say that a lot of older people are coming to them who are beginning to wonder about the meaning of life in the light of the COVID, just as equally many young people have been hammered. But I think people do need to be nurtured by the humanities, and that where once it was a thing that happened anyway in education, I think we might need to legislate a little bit for it now and to make it mandatory in secondary schools and technology colleges and universities that there be some such study. There are lots of other things I'd love to see happen. For instance, I'd love to see all the libraries that were closed reopened, all the police stations that were closed reopened. There's been a complete shutting down of these kind of social services, especially in rural communities, which then, surprise, surprise, report psychiatric problems, which probably will end up costing much more to deal with than the libraries and Garda stations cost to run. So a lot of the things to be done would be simple enough, but would be just throwing actions of the last 10 years by a misguided leadership into reverse.
You spoke about the specialization within academia today. And I wonder if you could draw upon your long experience as a teacher to talk about what it's like to teach outside of your particular area of specialization. There's a wonderful Keough workshop offered at Notre Dame called Teaching at the Edge of Your Expertise. And I know when I've done that myself, I've learned so much rather than teaching in my particular area. Is there a story you could share from your long teaching career about when you taught outside of your area and what you learned from it?
Well, in the early days, as I said, we were expected to know everything from Chaucer to the present moment. But my first teaching was at the University of Kent, where each first year course had a title like The Mind. There would be 3 teachers, 1 literary person, 1 psychologist, and maybe a theologian. And I listened to students coming out from those courses. I learned so much from them. And of course, as you know, Kathleen, a lot of the cutting edge books in all our disciplines are written by people on the cusp, people who were enlivened by these kinds of encounter. So, you know, on the one hand, you have a narrow drive to specialization expected of young postulant academics being interviewed for a job. But often the generation that's interviewing, or even older ones like me, have been allowed to take 5 or 10 years to write a much more generalized kind of book that might be in the end more meaningful even to the wider community. And it's odd to see these 2 contra movements in academia at the present moment. But I think we will go back to favoring the generalists. I mean, utter specialization is just a form of self-love and narcissistic and dangerous. You get like Mr. Casaubon in Little Market, and nobody wants that. It's like what C.L.R. James said once about English cricket. How can they know cricket who only cricket know? You know, if you want to read Joyce, you have to have read all that he read as well.
It was time, Rick.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We have a question from an audience member who asks you to share one story, and I know you have many, that could capture the depth and soul of Ireland. Could you share a story with us?
Gosh.
Just one, if you had to.
I just recently read the autobiography of my niece, Ivana Lynch, who played Luna Lovegood in the Harry Potter films. So I had a vested interest in reading it. I can teach Harry Potter anyway, so I had no reason. But and the book is about all kinds of things, not just her getting the Harry Potter gig, but how she triumphed over anorexia before that, how she appeared on Dancing with the Stars in America after that. But there's one page where she just describes as the anorexia is taking hold. She's about 10 or 11, and she is not understood by her parents, one of whom is my sister. but she loves them, and she just feels so alone. And she cycles up the roadway outside her house, and Lucky, her dog, goes with her, and she says, here is somebody I don't have to explain anything to or apologize about. But I don't know why. But I mean, there were terrible things and wonderful things in her book, which I didn't cry over. But the image of that child going up a road with the dog, yes, somehow it was like Dorothy and Toto. It's like the boy Stephen in Portrait of the Artist, you know, the Moopow going along the road. Somehow the image of the road, which I know is so important to American writers like Kerouac and so on, it's really important for us Irish too.
Declan, this question will not surprise you, and I'm sure it's not the first time it's been put to you, but I'm curious, as we all are, to hear how you answer it. Could you talk about what you see as the effect of Brexit on the potential for a united Ireland?
It's possible, as some English commentators are saying, that Brexit might bundle the North rather reluctantly and prematurely into united Ireland. I don't think that many of the commentators in London worry that much about Northern Ireland or Ireland, or know much about it. I am sure that Boris Johnson and the members of his cabinet are super ignorant on the topic. So in unleashing their own 1916 called Brexit, they have helped to destabilize a fragile peace process that was developing in the North. Now, of course, some nationalists here say, great, we'll take it. This is our moment. This is the opening. But I don't think it's a good approach. I think we need to be more gradualist in moving towards changes like this. I could see in 10 or 20 years, farmers in the north of Ireland thinking it's more in our interests to be represented in Brussels by the Irish Minister for Agriculture. And by a similar logic, other people in the north beginning to look further, more often towards Dublin. We tend to think of the North as binary, unionist, nationalist, but there's a whole other generation of young people coming up who probably are neither, and who will be very shrewd in the judgments they make, and who will have noticed that the Southern Irish are not particularly territorial or possessive now in their attitude to them, as revealed by our referendum on the Belfast Agreement. So I have always thought you get a united Ireland more likely by stealth than by vulgar programming.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our hour. I do want to make sure there aren't any questions from where you're sitting, Declan, because I can't see those.
Michael Sanfi of the Department of Foreign Affairs looks like he wants to review me about something.
Very, very quickly. Thanks very much.
Please.
I just wondered, your erstwhile colleague, Morgan Kelly, the economist in UCD, who wrote amazingly powerful articles about the crash and everything.
Yes.
I heard him say once that it wasn't that in any way he was an apologist for Catholicism, but that he expressed sort of worry about what was going to happen to Ireland with the disappearance of Catholicism, and it kind of would we not just all be like, kind of trough, I don't know if you use the word pigs in a trough, but he worried about the loss of a kind of restraining influence, because whatever, issues about Catholicism, it did have some kind of restraining on behavior and, some kind of idea of like, this is how I should behave. So I wonder, how do you feel about that in the sense of, isn't there kind of a vacuum now, and what's going to replace that?
Well, I mean, I said the Abbey Theatre and the Gaelic League filled the vacuum left by a vaporized Irish language. In the same way, I think there are new forms of spirituality emerging in the community, often with a Celtic element, and some of them appealing to what you might call alternative thinkers, some of whom indeed splice elements of Catholicism with the Celtic spirit. And they're almost like the more modern doctors here who combine university medicine with an element of folk medicine. So, when something appears to disappear, like the Catholic religion in many parts of the country, it doesn't really, it's just transmogrifying into something else. And I don't think Irish people, as you say, and you're right, and Morgan was right too, we have not been very good at living without religion. The last 20 years have left a lot of people miserable in its absence, and yet they cannot seem to identify with the institutional forms available. But I think in the end, that problem will get sorted. It's like the Russian people, you know, for decades they were told not to believe in these things, but they do. And I think it's the same here. It will come back, but not in the institutional forms in which it left us. By the way, I'll just make the point that I think a lot of the priests and nuns, as I hinted, were brilliant business managers, practical people. I think that there was a sense in which the power the Catholic Church achieved was administrative and bureaucratic, and that the bureaucracy is often something people have who have lost the real idea of God, and they substitute rules. It was a rule-bound Catholicism. It wasn't, you know, the happiest form of Catholicism, even as it progressed. And I remember when I was a young boy of 9 or 10, through November this month, you were told that you could get a holy soul out of purgatory if you went into the church, said 3 Our Fathers, 3 Hail Marys, 3 Glorias, and you ran out again. So I was running in and out of the church all afternoon. And then I would go home to my mother in the evening and say, I've got 15 people out of purgatory this afternoon. And this was some kind of Catholicism I grew up in, but it couldn't last. And maybe it's just as well it's been substituted by a different time.
Thank you, Declan. The chat is filled with just warmest thanks for your excellent lecture. And really, we're so appreciative, and we do wish we could all be together and celebrate, but I hope that we'll see, it won't be long before we're in person again. But just know how grateful I am, the Ancient Order of Hibernians and Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians, Keough Institute, and the Dublin Global Gateway for your presence and for your words of wisdom and eloquence. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for attending.
And thank you very much.
Thanks, Declan.